picture the ark. You already know the image, a great wooden vessel, impossibly large, riding out a catastrophe that swallowed the world. Animals in pairs, a righteous man at the helm, rain falling for 40 days until everything familiar disappears beneath the water. It is one of the oldest stories humanity has ever carried, passed from culture to culture, generation to generation, like something too important to ever be allowed to fade. But now, just for a moment, set that image gently aside. What if the ark was never a vessel at all? What if it was something older in purpose and stranger in design, not built to float above the flood, but built to survive what came before it? A vault, a sealed chamber, a deliberate act of preservation constructed not in panic, but in knowledge. Knowledge that something was ending and something had to be saved. That question is what we're going to sit with tonight. Because here is what makes this so quietly unsettling. The flood story does not belong to one tradition. It appears across Mesopotamia, across the ancient Near East, woven into Sumerian tablets that predate the Bible by thousands of years. And in those older, stranger versions, certain details shift in ways that matter. The shape changes, the purpose deepens, and the idea of preservation, of protecting the living memory of a civilization, begins to feel less like a metaphor and more like a memory. What we are exploring tonight is a possibility, not a certainty. We are going to move carefully through ancient texts, through archaeology, through architecture, and through the strange overlaps between myth and physical evidence. And we are going to ask whether the story of the ark could carry within it the echo of something real. Not necessarily a boat surviving a flood, but a civilization surviving a collapse. A world before our world, trying to send something forward through the dark. We will not claim to have the answer. That is not what this is. This is a place to wonder, to let the strangeness of the past wash over you slowly, without demanding resolution. So if you're lying in the dark somewhere right now, if the room is quiet and the night is long, this is exactly the right kind of question to fall asleep beside. Something ancient, something unresolved, something that has been asked across every continent and every century without ever quite being answered. Before we go any further, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Drop a comment and tell me what time it is where you are. There is something wonderful about knowing how many different midnights this question is travelling through. So let us open the texts themselves. The biblical account in Genesis is precise in ways that feel almost uncomfortable for a story we tend to treat as myth. The ark is given dimensions: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits tall. Depending on how you measure a cubit, that places the length somewhere between 400 and 500 feet. It is described as having multiple rooms, or in some translations, cells or nests. It has lower, middle, and upper decks. It has a single door set in its side, and it is sealed inside and out with something the Hebrew text calls kofar. That word is usually translated as pitch, a waterproofing tar, but kofar carries another meaning entirely in Hebrew. It is also the word for atonement, for covering, for protection in a theological sense. A word doing two kinds of work at once, which is itself worth pausing on. The material is gopher wood, and here is where things get quietly strange, because no one is entirely certain what gopher wood is. The word appears exactly once in the entire Hebrew Bible, right here in this single instruction. Some scholars suggest cypress, some suggest cedar, some suggest a type of resin wood. Others have noted that the word may be a transliteration of an older term from an older language, which would mean that by the time Genesis was written down, the original material had already become unclear, an ancient instruction copied forward faithfully but incompletely. Now hold that image and move east into the older clay. The Epic of Gilgamesh gives us Utnapishtim, the Babylonian counterpart to Noah, and his flood vessel is shaped differently. Where the biblical ark is a long rectangular structure, the vessel in Gilgamesh is described as a perfect cube. equal in all dimensions. Its interior divided into 7 levels, each level divided into 9 sections, 60 sections total. And like the biblical account, it is sealed with bitumen inside and out, with considerable attention paid to that sealing, to making it tight against what is coming. Now, a cube is not a boat. A cube is a terrible boat. It would spin and pitch and offer almost no directional control. But a cube is an extraordinarily stable sealed container. If you are designing something not to navigate water, but to survive being submerged, to keep its contents intact under pressure, under weight, under time, a cube begins to make a certain cold and logical sense. The Atrahasis epic, older still, gives another version, and here the vessel is sometimes described in ways that scholars have long debated. The instructions passed to the survivor come not from an open sky, but from behind a wall, whispered through a barrier, as though the knowledge itself is being smuggled across some boundary between what is permitted and what is not. The emphasis is on the preservation of living things, of seeds, of creatures, of the genetic and biological memory of the world before the water came. And this is where the translation issues begin to genuinely matter. The Hebrew word for ark in Genesis is teba. It is not the ordinary word for boat or ship or vessel. Those words exist in Hebrew. They are used elsewhere. But teba appears in only one other place in the entire Old Testament, and that place is the basket, woven from reeds and sealed with pitch, in which the infant Moses is hidden in the river. Not a ship, a container, a sealed, protected box placed into the current and trusted to survive. The same word used for both, separated by generations, connected by the act of preservation itself. In the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of Hebrew scripture, teba is rendered as kibotos, and kibotos means chest, it means box. It is the same word later used for the Ark of the Covenant, that other famous container of precious and dangerous things, sealed and carried and protected with extraordinary care. When you begin to hear all three together, Noah's Ark, Moses' basket, the Ark of the Covenant, all drawn from the same root concept, all describing not vessels built for travel, but containers built for protection, the nautical interpretation starts to feel like only one possible reading among several. Now, none of this is to say the ancient writers were being careless or inconsistent. Ancient writers describing extraordinary events, sacred events, world-altering events, almost never worked in purely practical language. They layered meaning. A structure could be simultaneously a physical object and a theological symbol and a cosmological statement all at once. The dimensions given for the ark in Genesis follow patterns that appear elsewhere in ancient Near Eastern sacred architecture, proportions that carried meaning beyond the merely functional. When an ancient Mesopotamian scribe described a flood vessel as a perfect cube, they may have been encoding something about order and completeness, and the preservation of a whole world in miniature. When a Hebrew writer described gopher wood, sealed with gopher, they may have been speaking simultaneously about waterproofing and about something protected, set apart, held in covenant against the coming darkness. The texts are not simple. They were never meant to be. They are doing multiple things at the same time, which is precisely what makes them so difficult to read and so impossible to entirely dismiss. What they agree on, across cultures, across centuries, across languages, is this: something was built, deliberately and with great care, before a catastrophe arrived. It was sealed. It carried what was most necessary to carry. And because of it, something survived that would otherwise have been lost forever. Whether that something was a boat riding above the water, or a vault buried beneath the storm, the texts themselves leave more room for that question than most of us were ever told. So where does the vault idea actually come from? It does not come from wishful thinking, or from people who distrust the story and want to replace it with something more comfortable. It comes, strangely enough, from paying very close attention to the story itself. Start with the shape. The biblical ark is a rectangle, long, wide, deep, with a flat bottom and sealed edges. That is not the silhouette of a vessel designed to move through water with any grace or purpose. Ships, even ancient ones, even primitive ones, taper. They curve, they cut, they are built to go somewhere. The Ark in Genesis is built to contain. And when you look at the Gilgamesh version, that perfect cube, the nautical logic collapses even further. A cube floating on open water would be a catastrophe for anything inside it. But a cube buried or braced or set into the earth against the violence of some overwhelming event behaves very differently. A cube becomes a strong room. It becomes a vault. Then there is the emphasis, repeated and deliberate, on sealing. The repeated application of kofa, of bitumen, of whatever substance was meant to make this thing impenetrable, does not read like someone preparing to ride out a storm on the surface of the water. It reads like someone preparing to keep something intact through whatever comes next. Pressure, time, contamination, the catastrophe from the outside meeting the preserved world within and losing. And then there is the cargo. This is where the vault theory stops being a quirky reinterpretation and starts asking a genuinely serious question. Because if what you needed to survive catastrophe was the capacity to restart civilization, what would you actually put inside a sealed container? Not just animals in the sense we tend to imagine them, two of every species marching in pairs into a wooden boat. Think instead about what survival after total collapse actually requires. You need breeding populations, yes. You need genetic diversity. But you also need seeds. You need the knowledge of how to plant them. When, in what soil, under what conditions. You need the memory of how things were done before. Because when the water recedes, or the fires cool, or the sky clears, you will be starting from almost nothing. And the difference between having that knowledge and not having it is the difference between recovery and extinction. A floating rescue craft saves lives in the immediate term. It keeps you above the water until the water stops. But a sealed repository, a vault designed for the aftermath, is concerned with a different problem entirely. Not survival during the event, but survival after it. Not the crisis, but the reconstruction. That distinction matters more than it might seem at first. Because if the Ark is a rescue vessel, its purpose ends when the flood ends. But if the Ark is a vault, its purpose begins precisely when the flood ends. The sealed contents are not just passengers waiting to disembark. They are resources. They are the archive of a world that almost did not make it, seeds that carry the memory of 10,000 years of cultivation, animals that represent the genetic range of what lived before, and perhaps, though the texts only hint at this, something more. Knowledge, records, the accumulated understanding of how to build, how to heal, how to measure and calculate and pass things down to those who come after. An archive of what was preserved deliberately, so that what comes next does not have to begin entirely in the dark. There is also something worth sitting with in the possibility that the flood story, across its many versions, across the Mesopotamian plain, and the Hebrew tradition, and the dozens of flood narratives found on nearly every inhabited continent, may be compressing more than one memory into a single image. Human catastrophe is not rare. Civilizations have collapsed before. Coastlines have drowned. Entire ways of life have been obliterated by events that left almost nothing behind except the stories of those who survived them and tried desperately to pass something forward. If each of those collapses left a memory, and those memories were carried and retold and layered together over generations, what would emerge might look exactly like this: a single overwhelming flood, a single desperate act of preservation, a single vessel carrying the seed of the world forward through the darkness. The compression of multiple historical collapses into one story is not a failure of memory. It is how memory works, especially across deep time. The specific events blur, the emotional and practical truth of them does not, and the practical truth of catastrophe, repeated through human experience, is always the same. Something was almost lost. Someone saved what could be saved. The world rebuilt around what survived. It is worth being honest about what this interpretation is and what it is not. The vault theory is not a settled conclusion. It is not the secret truth that scholars are suppressing. It is a lens, a way of reading texts that were never straightforwardly literal to begin with, written by people who understood that a physical object and a symbolic one could exist in the same description simultaneously. The ark as vault does not require you to abandon the ark as boat. It asks only whether boat is the only thing the story was ever trying to say. And the honest answer, looking at the shape of the thing, the emphasis on sealing, the nature of the cargo, the multiple ancient traditions that all circle the same core image, is that it probably is not. Something about the vault idea has been there all along, quietly present in the dimensions and the materials and the purpose of what was built. Not a ship sailing towards safety. A sealed room, waiting for the storm to pass, so that what was held inside it could step out into a changed world and begin the long work of putting things back together. If we follow that thread, the thread of a sealed room waiting out a storm that is larger than any single rainfall, we eventually bump into a more unsettling question. Where did these people get the idea of a world-ending collapse in the first place? The usual answer is simple. They made it up. It is myth, metaphor, a way of talking about human wickedness and divine judgment, or about kingship and obedience, or about the anxiety that hangs over every ancient farmer who looks at the sky and wonders if the rains will come. But when you start to compare the stories, not just within one culture, but across many, a different possibility quietly appears. Maybe they did not invent the idea from nothing. Maybe they remembered something. Not perfectly. Not in a way a modern historian would recognize in a field report, but in the way human beings have always remembered the worst thing that ever happened to them, by turning it into a story that refuses to die. Begin in Mesopotamia, where the soil itself is made of old rivers. The Epic of Gilgamesh gives us Utnapishtim, warned by the god Ea that the assembly of gods has decided to wipe out humankind with a flood. He is told to tear down his house, build that strange cube of a vessel, and load it with the seed of all living creatures. The storm that follows is not a gentle rise of water. It is described as a war. Winds scream, darkness falls, the gods themselves cower like dogs. When it is over, the landscape is flat and silent, like a world erased. Older still is Atrahasis, another Mesopotamian text, where the gods, irritated by human noise, send successive plagues and famines, and finally a flood to solve the problem permanently. Again, one man is given instructions to build a sealed craft and preserve life. Again, afterward, there is negotiation, new rules, a kind of cosmic compromise about how the world will be run from now on. Move west into the Levant, and the biblical narrative picks up that same pulse. The earth is filled with violence, the text says, corruption. There is a decision at some higher level that things cannot continue as they are. There is a structure to be built, a covenant to follow, measurements, materials, cargo. The waters arrive, from above and below, the world is scrubbed clean, and when the door finally opens again, what follows is not just survival, but reordering. Laws, covenants, prohibitions about blood and murder, promises about seed time and harvest. The story lingers, not on the chaos, but on the restart. Further along the Mediterranean, in Greece, you find Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus decides to drown a corrupt human race. Prometheus quietly warns his son, Deucalion, who builds a chest, a kind of box rather than a sleek ship, and rides out the deluge with his wife. When they land on a mountain, the world is empty. To repopulate it, they throw stones over their shoulders, which turn into men and women. It is a different image, but the same pattern. A flood, a container, a mountain, and then a new humanity beginning again from a remnant. Travel east, and the stories change their dress, but not entirely their bones. In parts of India, later texts preserve memories of a great flood in the story of Manu. A small fish asks him for protection, warning of an oncoming deluge. Manu shelters the fish, which grows enormous and eventually pulls his boat to safety when the waters rise. Here too, the emphasis after the flood is on sacrifice, on the re-establishment of ritual, on the reseeding of the world. Manu offers libations, performs rites, and living beings are said to emerge again from those acts. The story is not only about not drowning, it is about restarting the proper order of things. If you widen the circle even further, you begin to hear similar notes from almost everywhere humans have lived. Traditional stories from the Americas, from Australia, from parts of Southeast Asia, from the Pacific Islands, speak of waters that rose and rose, of mountains that became islands, of canoes or rafts or high houses in which a few survived. Some of these are clearly shaped by local experiences of storms and tsunamis and river floods. Others feel stranger, more like echoes of something larger that no single village or coastline could fully explain. Does this mean there was one single global flood that somehow found its way into every memory, every tongue, every tradition? Most geologists and historians would say no. The physical evidence for a worldwide ocean, covering all the land in human times, simply is not there in the way a literal reading might want it to be. But that does not mean there were no floods large enough to change everything for the people who survived them. At the end of the last ice age, the world looked very different. Enormous sheets of ice locked up vast amounts of water. Sea levels were lower, coastlines further out. As the ice began to melt, slowly at first and then in pulses, the oceans rose. Not in a single day, not in 40 nights, but over centuries and millennia. From a planetary perspective, this is slow. From the perspective of a family on the same stretch of shoreline for generations, watching the sea creep inland, swallow sandbars, drown old paths, turn freshwater marsh into salty bay, it can feel like an inexorable, malevolent tide. Stories about such changes do not talk in centimetres per year. They talk in images, in all or nothing events. First there was land, then there was water. Grandfather says there used to be a village where the waves break now. His grandfather says there used to be fields. Somewhere along that chain, it becomes a story about a time when the waters came and did not stop. Add to this the more abrupt disasters. As ice dams failed, enormous glacial lakes are thought to have drained catastrophically, sending walls of water rushing through valleys, gouging out new channels, rearranging entire landscapes in days or weeks. In the Black Sea region, one influential hypothesis suggests that rising Mediterranean waters may have poured in through the Bosporus, turning a smaller freshwater lake into a larger saltwater sea at extraordinary speed on a human timescale. Along the world's coasts, tsunamis triggered by earthquakes or submarine landslides would have erased whole communities without warning. Each of these events, from the slow drowning of shores to the sudden swallowing of towns, would have been a world-ending experience for someone. The survivors would have carried that experience in their bodies, in their language, in the way they taught their children where it was safe to build and where it was not. And because human societies are not static, those memories moved with people as they migrated, married, traded, and warred. Over time, specific dates, specific river names, specific fault lines would blur, slide over one another, fuse. What would remain vivid was the emotional geometry of the event. Before, safety, normality, then overwhelming water, then a small remainder of life, clinging to some higher place beginning again. This is what cultural memory does with disaster. It does not create a neutral chronicle. It creates a pattern. We can watch that pattern at work in more recent history. Whole traditions develop around the memory of cities burned, of plagues, of invasions. The further away you move from the event, the more the storyline simplifies. The why condenses. It becomes about moral failure, or divine displeasure, or the hubris of kings, because those provide understandable reasons for why the worst thing happens. They also provide instructions for how not to let it happen again. So it is not surprising that flood stories nearly always come wrapped, not only in terror, but in instruction. They are not solely about the water, they are about what must be preserved and what must change. In the Mesopotamian traditions, the flood is followed by the giving of new measures, new contracts between human beings and the divine. In Atrahasis, work is redistributed, mortality itself is adjusted, as if the gods are rebalancing an overcrowded system. In the Hebrew text, the rainbow is framed as a sign of a new covenant, and with it come rules about blood, about murder, about justice. In Greek tellings, Deucalion and Pyrrha are not just survivors, they are the parents of a new line, from which the Greeks of later ages trace their identity and their institutions. A fresh genealogy to justify how things are now ordered. In Indian stories, Manu's world after the flood is structured by sacrifice and dharma, by the proper performance of duties that keep cosmic order intact. Again and again, collapse narratives shift quickly from the drama of destruction to the quiet, deliberate work of re-establishing law, agriculture, ritual, and hierarchy. The moment the waters recede, the focus of the story snaps to planting, to herding, to building altars, to re-inscribing boundaries. The meaning of the flood, in these traditions, is bound up not so much with the wet chaos itself, as with the kind of world that is built afterward. And in that light, the image of a vault begins to make a different kind of sense. If these are not just free-floating tales but distorted memories of real episodes of loss, of shorelines abandoned, river valleys devastated, cities swallowed, fields turned to salt, then the obsession with carrying forward the seed of all living things is not merely poetic, it is practical. You do not just want to survive the wave, you want to be able to recreate the way of life that made your world intelligible. Seeds in this context are not just literal kernels of grain. They are the beginnings of wheat and barley, yes, but also the knowledge of when to sow them, how to irrigate them, how to store them so that next year there will be bread. Animals are not just pairs of creatures spared for their own sake. They are flocks and herds, the basis of meat and milk and wool and traction, the foundation of sacrifice and feasting and economy. Laws are not just commands written on stone. They are the remembered patterns of who owes what to whom, of how to resolve disputes, of what is sacred and what is forbidden. Collapse stories, when you listen to them carefully, are obsessed with bottlenecks. Something huge has pressed the world down to almost nothing. Only a narrow channel remains through which life can pass. In that channel, choices matter. What do you bring with you? What do you leave behind? What is carried as memory alone? And what is given a physical form? A tablet, a scroll, a jar of seed, a breeding pair of animals, a set of rituals, so that it can bridge the gap between the world that ended and the world that comes after. When ancient traditions speak of a righteous man or a wise king being told to prepare for a coming flood, they are not only talking about his personal virtue, they are talking about someone being entrusted with the task of choosing what will pass through the bottleneck. In that sense, the ark, however imagined, is always a kind of vault. It is the container for those choices. Seen this way, the last collapse the stories gesture toward may not have been singular, not one neat apocalypse with a date you could mark on a timeline, but a series of regional catastrophes, some sudden, some gradual, each engraving fear into memory. Over generations, those engravings were layered until they formed a single, deep groove in the human imagination. The world almost ended. It will, perhaps, almost end again. When it does, the only hope is to have made preparations beforehand, to have stored up what matters most. That is the quiet logic running beneath the thunder and rain and roaring waters of these tales. It is less about divine anger than it is about human continuity, less about punishment than about preservation. And once you begin to see flood stories as archives of remembered collapse, a mosaic of drowned coasts, failed monsoons, broken levees, sinking cities, you can start to ask a different kind of question about the ark itself. Not just, did it float? But what earlier disaster is it trying so hard not to forget? What vanished world lies just behind its planked walls and sealed seams, carried forward in the form of seeds and laws, and the fragile knowledge of how to make a livable world from bare earth once again? Once you start looking for that quiet logic of preservation, you begin to see it everywhere in the archaeological record, in places that never mention an ark at all. Think of the first farmers in the broad band from the Levant through Mesopotamia into Anatolia. Their survival hinged on a single season's gamble. Would the grain sprout, grow, and ripen before frost or drought or locusts stole it? If they ate every seed in a hungry year, there would be nothing to plant in the spring. So they did something that looks simple but is actually astonishingly sophisticated. They stored the future. Across early villages like Jericho, Çatalhöyük, and countless lesser-known sites, we find thick-walled silos and storage pits sunk into floors, lined with plaster or clay, sometimes even burnished to reduce moisture seepage. Jars sealed with clay stoppers or bitumen plugs held barley, wheat, pulses. The grain wasn't just piled in a heap. It was measured, sorted, segregated. Sometimes one room in a house is given over almost entirely to storage, as if that family's continued existence was concentrated into that single, silent space. Underground, away from sunlight and temperature swings, food can last astonishingly long. In some desert sites, archaeologists have found charred seeds still identifiable after thousands of years. Someone once had placed them carefully where the elements could not easily reach. In that light, the ark's obsession with food, of every food that is eaten, carefully gathered and stored, sounds less like mythic detail and more like what any ancient farmer would think about first. Surviving the storm is meaningless if the next year's harvest fails. But food was only part of the equation. If you live with animals, your wealth and your future are walking on four legs. In pastoral societies, preserving breeding stock through a bad winter or a drought is a matter of community destiny. The language of pairs in the flood traditions echoes what herders and farmers actually did in crisis. They culled selectively, preserved the strongest breeding animals, protected the best milk cows, the most fertile ewes, the stallions and bulls that could rebuild a herd from almost nothing. Ancient law codes and contracts are full of disputes about livestock. Who owns which animal? Who is responsible for a lost calf? What happens if a bull gores someone? That may sound mundane, but it tells you where people thought the stakes were. A lost ox was not just a lost beast. It was lost ploughing power, lost calves, lost sacrifice, lost status. In a severe famine, communities sometimes chose to slaughter weaker animals so that precious fodder could be reserved for those few capable of restarting the herd. So when a text says, "Take of every clean animal by sevens, a male and his female," it is not merely a theological aside about ritual categories. It reads in part like the logic of a breeder: redundancy, genetic diversity, enough individuals to avoid a bottleneck too narrow to recover from. Then there is the matter of tools and knowledge. A bag of seed is useless if you forget when to plant, how deep to plough, when to flood the field, and when to drain it. Across the ancient Near East we find not just storerooms, but what are effectively knowledge vaults. Temple complexes in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and beyond often included archives. Rooms stacked with clay tablets or rolls of papyrus, holding lists of offerings, hymns, legal decisions, astronomical observations, medical prescriptions, lexical lists of words in multiple languages. In cities like Nineveh, at the Library of Ashurbanipal, there is evidence of deliberate collecting, scribes copying earlier texts, organising them, marking them as part of a royal archive. These were not only bureaucratic records, they were the encoded memory of how to run irrigation networks, levy taxes, heal wounds, choose auspicious days for planting or building. When empires fell and cities burned, one of the first casualties was often these archives, But sometimes they survived, protected by their own misfortune. A library burned in place could bake clay tablets hard enough to last millennia. Picture a scribe standing in such a room as rumours of war swirl or as river levels drop year after year. What do you save? The hymns, the omen texts, the lists of years and kings, the treaties, the manual for canal maintenance, the rituals for appeasing angry gods, the knowledge of how to measure out barley rations so a population can be fed through a lean season without exhausting the stores. Some of it you might hope to carry in your head. Some of it you would want to fix in something more durable than memory. In Egypt, certain temple precincts functioned as sealed spaces of preservation. Grain was stored in massive, buttressed magazines, rows of long, narrow rooms with tiny windows, high up, designed to keep the contents cool and dry. Priests oversaw not only religious rites but the redistribution of bread and beer, the very basics of survival. Sacred texts were kept in houses of life, guarded by ritual. You can think of these complexes as a fusion of granary, treasury, and archive, a layered vault for calories and concepts alike. Further into the hills and deserts, we find another strategy: concealment by remoteness. Caves with pottery jars brimming with scrolls, fortified hilltop sites with cisterns, and storerooms carved into bedrock. In later periods, groups under threat, whether from invading armies or from internal upheaval, hid their most precious writings in places where only the initiated would think to look. The Dead Sea Scrolls, tucked into desert caves, are one famous example of that impulse. When the world closes in, hide the words that matter in stone and darkness and dry air, and trust that someone, someday, might find them again. Go up into the highlands of Anatolia or the Zagros, and you encounter yet another form: mountain refugees. Some are simple, rock shelters with traces of hearths and animal bones, evidence that people retreated upslope in times of danger. Others are more elaborate, fortresses and citadels positioned to control passes, with storerooms dug into cliffs, reservoirs perched above valleys. In a flood-prone world, height is safety. In a world of raiding and war, height is also defence. The mountain plus the storehouse becomes a recurring survival template. Now fold all these threads: granaries, livestock management, archives, high refuges, back into the Ark story. The instructions given to the builder sound strangely like a synthesis of everything a crisis-hardened agrarian society might care about. Bring food, bring animals, not in random assortment, but according to kinds and numbers that suggest breeding strategies. Bring your household, the basic social unit through which knowledge and labour and ritual are transmitted. Seal yourself up in a structure with precise internal divisions. Wait out the catastrophe in a space that is part shelter, part storehouse, part moving archive. The text lingers on the organisation: lower, second and third decks, rooms or compartments. The idea is order within confinement, categories preserved inside chaos. Anyone who has ever run a serious storage facility understands that organisation is not a luxury, it is survival. If you cannot find the seed jars when you need them, if you cannot separate the animals properly, if you cannot maintain cleanliness and ritual even in a cramped space, your chances diminish quickly. Elsewhere in the ancient world, we see that same instinct at work. At sites in the Levant and Mesopotamia, archaeologists sometimes find entire buildings whose primary function, as far as we can tell, was storage and administration. Rows of jars still in place, ceilings from baskets and containers, bullae impressed with the marks of officials. These were not homes in the domestic sense. They were collective vaults, places where a community surplus was protected and its obligations tracked. In some cities, those granaries are heavily built, sometimes attached to temples or palaces, sometimes enclosed within thick defensive walls. If enemies burned the outer houses, perhaps the central store would remain. If locusts stripped the fields, The grains in the sealed rooms might carry people through the lean years. There is another level too, more intangible, but no less vital: the preservation of what to do when the waters recede. Stories themselves function as a kind of manual. Embedded in myth are instructions: what to sacrifice, whom to trust, how to rebuild. Flood narratives often end with altars, with offerings, with promises about the rhythm of seasons. Seed time and harvest shall not cease, one tradition says, as if to reassure listeners that, despite the horror of interruption, the pattern will resume. You can hear in that line not only theology but something more practical. A reminder that agriculture will still be possible, that it is worth clinging to the techniques and calendars and rituals that make planting and harvesting work. Do not abandon the old knowledge, the story whispers, because after the storm you will need it again. If you put all this together, the physical vaults of grain and seed, the careful curation of breeding animals, the scribal archives, the fortified storehouses, the mountain refugees, the narrative instructions, it becomes tempting to read the Ark tradition as part of a broader survival culture. Not an isolated miracle, but the mythologized tip of an iceberg of emergency planning that ancient communities learned, often harshly, to practice. From that angle, the Ark begins to look less like a fantastic exception and more like an idealized version of what every prudent city or village tried to be in miniature: a container of life against the next collapse. A model storehouse scaled up to cosmic proportions. And then another question suggests itself. What if, buried inside the religious language and the divine decrees, the Ark narrative is partly a manual disguised as history, a sacred story that encodes in unforgettable imagery the steps a community should take when they sense that the world they know is about to end? Gather food, preserve seed, protect breeding pairs, carry forward your laws and rituals. Withdraw to the high place, the sealed chamber, the mountain refuge. Wait, emerge when the danger has passed, replant, rebreed, rebuild, remember. If that is even partly true, then the Arka's Vault idea is not an eccentric modern spin. It is a way of hearing what ancient people were already doing, turning hard-earned survival strategies into stories so durable that they could outlast kingdoms, languages, and even the specific disasters that first taught them what needed to be saved. If you listen carefully to the measurements the text gives for the Ark, something quietly strange happens. It starts to sound less like anything that ever cut through waves and more like something that was never meant to go anywhere at all. The biblical description is famously specific: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Ancient cubits varied, but even if you take a conservative estimate, you're dealing with a long, low, broad box. The length to width ratio is roughly 6:1, the height about half the width. Naval architects have noticed that those proportions are remarkably stable, but not for speed or elegance or manoeuvrability. They are stable for one thing: not capsizing. When engineers have modelled that shape, they find it could survive very rough seas if it were sufficiently well built and sealed. It would roll, it would pitch, but it would be extraordinarily hard to flip. Imagine not a sleek ship with a prow cutting the surf, but a colossal timber barge, a floating warehouse. No sail, no oars, no rudder mentioned. Just a structure meant to ride out violence by not engaging with it. That by itself is a curious clue. In a world of river trade and seafaring along coasts, people knew what boats looked like. They knew about curved hulls and pointed bows and means of steering. Yet the Ark, in its most detailed ancient description, is resolutely unboat-like. It is all right angles and decks and compartments, as if someone took a house or a granary and imagined it lifted, intact, into a flood. Think for a moment about how different that is from most mythic vessels. In later traditions, heroic ships have names, captains, adventures. They are characters in the story. The Ark is not. The Ark never earns a name. It's more like a device, a container. Its personality is its capacity. If you design a structure whose only job is to stay intact and not sink, your priorities shift. You care less about how it moves through water, and more about how water moves around it, and how everything inside can be arranged so that life can go on in some cramped approximation of normal. Stability and buoyancy, not grace. Buoyancy is simple enough in principle. Displace enough water, keep the walls from leaking, and you float. But stability is another matter. A narrow vessel is nimble but tips easily. A broad one resists rolling. The ark's width, disproportionate by the standards of fast ships, makes sense if your nightmare is not slowness, but capsizing. Its low, elongated profile helps lower the centre of mass, especially if the heavier stores sit on the bottom deck. Inside, the text imagines rooms, literally nests or compartments, and 3 levels. That is a storage planner's dream. Weight down low, lighter, more fragile things above. Animals segregated, fodder separated from grain, waste channeled away if possible. It is the same logic you find in long, narrow granaries and tiered magazines in ancient temple complexes. Depth, division, and an obsession with keeping categories from contaminating each other. But life sealed into such a box quickly runs into a more subtle engineering problem. Air. Ventilation is barely mentioned in the story. Depending on translation, there is a single window, an opening, perhaps a light near the top, and an injunction to cover the hole with pitch. You have to picture the lived reality of that. Humans, large animals, fodder, waste, moisture, all locked into an enormous crate for months. Anyone who has been in a crowded stable knows how quickly air goes bad. In long-distance shipping of animals today, ventilation is one of the limiting factors. Without circulating air, ammonia from waste, carbon dioxide from breathing, and plain heat build up to lethal levels. Even in comparatively small ancient storage rooms, builders often included high vents, tiny windows, or porous brickwork to allow some kind of air exchange while keeping pests and thieves out. The ark's description gives us a riddle. A single opening around the top might be a continuous gap below the roofline, a sort of clerestory vent. From a structural point of view, that makes sense for a barge. Your walls remain strong and unperforated lower down, where waves hit hardest, but there is some avenue for light and air above. It sounds, in other words, like a compromise between airtightness and breathability. The same kind of compromise ancient architects made in sealed grain magazines with narrow high slits. Again, the picture that forms is not of a ship with decks open to the sky and sailors running about, but of a sealed chamber with carefully regulated openings. A vault with just enough leakage to support life. This is where the line between floating structure and land-based refuge begins to blur. The same design questions arise whether you're imagining an ark on water or a storehouse cut into rock above a floodline, or a titanic cellar with one heavily guarded entrance. How thick do the walls need to be? How many internal partitions keep order without trapping people in a fire or collapse? How do you admit air and light without admitting chaos? If you strip away the water from the story, what remains strongly resembles a kind of idealized emergency bunker. Picture an elongated rectangular hall divided into 3 levels by wooden floors, cells, and compartments opening off central corridors. A large opening all around near the roofline to let smoke and stale air out, perhaps covered or shuttered in bad weather. A door massive enough to be symbolically shut from outside. People, animals, and stores arranged by kind and value. On land, such a structure could be half sunk into a hillside, banked with earth for insulation and strength. It could be built into a cliff like some of the rock-cut magazines and tombs of later periods. It could be one wing of a more complex fortress-temple complex, the House of Provisions, or House of Life, into which a community withdraws when disaster looms. Transferred into flood language, that bunker becomes a boat without needing its architecture to change. The same word could stretch to fit both realities, especially when stories pass through languages and centuries. A chest, a box, a container that preserves. Whether it rests on bedrock or rides on waves may matter less to the storyteller than the fact that it stands between survival and oblivion. The Mesopotamian flood stories show a similar ambiguity. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim's boat is given as a cube, equal in length, width, and height, a shape that no sailor would ever choose, but a craftsman familiar with bricks and city blocks might. It feels like a house fortified against water rather than a ship. Doors are sealed with pitch, joinery is obsessively tightened. Guidance is handed over to the flood itself. Human control stops at the threshold. What happens outside is not navigation, but surrender. In all of these traditions, steering is conspicuously absent from the human job description. The builder is told how big to make the structure, how many levels, what to put inside, how to seal it. No one hands him a sail plan. No one instructs him in currents or stars. The ark is not meant to be piloted, only endured. That makes sense if your cultural memory is shaped by sudden overwhelming events. Flash floods, dam breaks, river avulsions, coastal surges, where the idea of sailing to safety would have felt absurd. If the land disappears under you, if the river leaps its banks by many meters in a single night, you do not think of cutting through waves. You think of clinging to whatever floats and hoping it does not roll. Ancient barge builders on rivers like the Euphrates or the Nile already understood this kind of craft. Big, slow platforms that drifted with the current or were towed laboriously, more concerned with not overturning than with getting somewhere quickly. Move those instincts into the imaginative space of ultimate catastrophe. Multiply the scale many times, cover it with the language of the sacred, and you arrive at something like the Ark, a barge to end all barges, a floating granary, a moving mountain refuge. But perhaps the most telling feature of the Ark's design is how indifferent it is to our modern categories. We are tempted to ask, almost automatically, could it sail? Could it be built exactly as specified? How would it handle this kind of wave height? Those are fair questions, and engineers have had interesting fun playing with models and computer simulations. Yet they may be the wrong questions to ask of an ancient sacred text. The people who first heard these stories were not naval engineers critiquing hull efficiency. They were farmers, herders, town dwellers who saw rivers in flood, storms roll in from the sea, cities battered by water and wind. For them, the question was not whether a vessel could maintain heading in a force 10 gale. It was whether anything at all, could possibly keep the essentials of life dry, intact, and breathing long enough for order to return. From that perspective, the Ark's ungainly shape is not a flaw, it is the point. Its very impracticality as a ship highlights its practicality as a vault. It is too boxy to be a good boat, but exactly boxy enough to be a storehouse that happens, in the story, to be set adrift. And here we reach the limit of how far modern engineering analysis can take us. We can calculate buoyancy, estimate displacement, speculate about timber strength and internal volume. We can compare the dimensions to known barges from ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, and we can nod when the ratios turn out to be passably realistic for a passive drifter. What we cannot do is flatten a myth into a blueprint. The text was not composed as a technical manual for shipyards. Its precision is symbolic as much as structural. 3 decks echo other triples in ancient cosmology: heaven, earth, underworld, upper, middle, lower. The numbers themselves may carry numerological weight, signalling completeness rather than optimal hull performance. If we insist on reading every cubit as literal and nautical, we miss the possibility that the Ark's true reference point was never a shipwright's yard, but the storeroom and the sanctuary. It may be that the ancient mind that shaped these lines began from what was most familiar: the dimensions of a large hall, the feel of sturdy beams overhead, the sight of jars in orderly rows, the memory of a mountain stronghold with tiered chambers. Then over generations those images fused with the terror of waters rising and the longing for a container big enough to hold a world. Boat, barge, sealed chamber. Perhaps the Ark is all three at once, precisely because the story is less interested in watercraft than in containment. It preserves categories, not courses. It is the idea of a vault stretched over the chaos of a flood, and when the narrative finally brings that container to rest, it does not drift into some distant, exotic port. It comes to ground on a mountain, in a place that sounds less like a harbour and more like the kind of high, secluded storehouse we have already seen scattered through the ancient landscape. Mountains are always waiting in the background of these stories, as if the land itself is holding its breath. When the Ark comes to rest, it does not settle on a plain or beside a city or on some rebuilt harbour wall. It stops high up among peaks. In Genesis, it is the mountains of Ararat. In Mesopotamian versions, it is Mount Nisia or another remote height. In later traditions, people argue endlessly over which modern mountain corresponds to the ancient name. But the precise peak may be less important than the fact that it is a mountain at all. Across the ancient Near East, mountains were not just landscape, they were symbols of survival. When everything low is drowned, burned, raided, or washed away, what remains visible on the horizon are the heights. They are the last refugees of snow, of springs, of forests. In a flood, they are the remaining islands of land. In a drought, they are where water still seeps from rock. In an invasion, they are where people flee with what they can carry. To a people whose lives unfold mostly in river valleys and fertile plains, mountains become the natural image of something that endures when ordinary life does not. They are also, over and over again, places of revelation and law. Moses receives the tablets on Sinai, a mountain of God. Elijah hears the thin, quiet voice on Horeb. In Mesopotamia, temple towers, ziggurats, are literally called mountain houses, artificial, sacred peaks built on flat ground to imitate the cosmic mountain where heaven and earth meet. In Greek imagination, Olympia and Olympus rise as the thrones of gods. In the Iranian plateau, holy heights are associated with the watchers of the world. Put simply, if you want to say that a place is closer to the divine, more stable than human chaos, more likely to preserve what matters, you put it on a mountain. So when a story says the Ark rested on a mountain, we can hear two overlapping meanings. One is literal. The waters recede, the structure lodges on a slope, the survivors step out onto rocky ground. The other is symbolic. After chaos, life finds footing not just anywhere, but in a place already coded as refuge, as sanctuary, as the meeting point of sky, stone, and the will of the gods. Now think of mountains not as lone peaks, but as systems of refuges. Everywhere that agrarian civilizations develop in lowlands, you find corresponding highland zones where people stash things they do not want easily touched. Caves tucked into limestone cliffs, shelves and ledges fronted by dry stone walls, shrines that are also storehouses, fortified hilltops with cisterns, granaries and hidden passages. In the rugged regions around Anatolia and the Caucasus, the broader area later associated with Ararat, archaeologists have documented ancient cave complexes used intermittently for millennia. Some are ritual sites, some show evidence of storage, jars, bins, traces of grain. In the Levant, from the Bronze Age onward, small highland sanctuaries often have annexes that function as magazines, places to keep offerings, temple treasure, or emergency supplies. This pattern repeats far beyond the Near East. In the Andes, storage facilities called kolkas studded the slopes above Inca roads, holding surplus maize and potatoes in cool, dry air. In the Himalayan regions, monasteries perched on cliffs held not only scriptures and relics, but seed stores and valuables for surrounding communities. In Mediterranean islands, people hid their finest goods in caves reachable only by rope or narrow paths safe from pirates. There is a basic human instinct at work. When you fear flood, enemy, or famine, you push your valuables up and in, up to higher ground, in to the rock. If we return to the ark with that instinct in mind, the mountain becomes more than an accidental landing point. It begins to look like the natural destination of a culture's most precious storehouse. In the flood narrative, the sequence is familiar. Waters rise, the ark floats, waters fall, the ark rests on a mountain. We can read that as a travel log. The structure goes wherever the water takes it until gravity stops the motion. But there is another way to frame the same journey. Imagine a community that already associates mountains with safety. When signs of catastrophe appear, rising rivers, ominous omens, they withdraw not into boats, but into their existing high refuges. Caverns, rock-cut halls, strongholds perched above floodlines. There they have prepared chambers with provisions, animals, seeds and records. The disaster comes. Those below are swept away. Those above wait in darkness and anxiety until the violence subsides. When they finally emerge, they step out onto slopes that overlook a transformed world. From within their own memory, the most vivid pivot point in that story is not, we went somewhere, but we came out. We came out of the vault, the cave, the sanctuary. We opened the door. We saw that the waters had receded. We descended back to the plains. Centuries later, when the story is retold in a culture that frames the catastrophe as total inundation, that emergence can be rephrased in the language of a drifting structure, coming to rest. In both versions, the decisive moment is attached to a mountain. But in one, the mountain is the thing that stops the ark. In the other, it is the thing that already sheltered it. The biblical text leaves a faint echo of that second possibility. The ark rested in the mountains before the tops of other hills became visible. Then months pass while the waters continue to decrease, before the ground is dry enough to leave. The ark is on high ground while much of the world is still waterlogged. That is exactly what a high refuge would feel like, safe but isolated, above other landforms still half drowned in mud and ponds. Across traditions, mountains that anchor flood stories have a second life as holy places or sites of secret things. The broad mountains of Ararat region later becomes associated not only with covenant and rainbow, but with legendary hidden monasteries, manuscript hoards, and treasuries tucked into remote valleys. In Jewish and Christian imagination, Sinai and Zion, though not flood mountains, function similarly. High places from which law, wisdom, and instruction descend, and where temple archives and treasures are kept. Mesopotamian literature speaks of the mountain of the assembly of the gods, where divine decrees are stored and from which fates are decided. Some Sumerian texts imagine tablets of destinies held in a god's mountain house, to be stolen or recovered in cosmic dramas. In later Iranian and Central Asian lore, isolated peaks hide the storehouses of snow, the sources of rivers, and thus life itself, and sometimes the chests of kings. Think also of later archive traditions that consciously imitate the mountain logic, even when terrain is flat. Great libraries and treasuries are built as artificial hills, raised platforms, stepped pyramids, ziggurats. The tablets of a city's laws are set in elevated chambers, reached by stairs, above the bustle of markets and streets, as if high ground itself guarantees preservation. Or consider hidden treasury lore, stories of kings who conceal their wealth in secret chambers under hills, of documents sealed in caves to await a more faithful generation. The Dead Sea. Scrolls in their jars in desert caves are a very late and very literal example, but they sit at the end of a long line of impulses, put the most vital, fragile things in a hard-to-reach, naturally durable container, as close as possible to high, dry, stable rock. In that frame, a mountain is not just a landing site, it is a system of storehouses, some natural, some carved, some imagined. The ark on the mountain, in a story about preserving life and knowledge, through a collapse, fits into the same mental category as the mountain treasury, the mountain monastery, the mountain archive. It is where you would expect the last, best copies of the world to be. There is also the way geography stamps memory. Ancient Near Eastern civilizations lived in landscapes where rivers could and did misbehave on a terrifying scale. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded irregularly, sometimes catastrophically. The Nile's failure or excess shaped Egyptian history. Sudden local deluges filled basins and wadi systems, tearing away fields and villages. Volcanic eruptions and earthquakes in surrounding mountain belts sent landslides and tsunamis toward coasts and plains. When such events happen, the people in lowlands remember water coming from above, rains, walls of runoff, debris-choked torrents. Those in foothills and uplands remember water rushing down from even higher ridges. Those actually on the high ridges may remember only clouds, thunder, and the strange sense of being above a disaster they can glimpse in valleys below. Generations later, when these memories are turned into stories of a single great catastrophe, the mental map that emerges is layered. Below is destruction and erasure. Above is survival and vantage point. The mountain is where witnesses stand to watch the undoing and remaking of the world. So when a tale says that a man, his family, and the essentials of life were preserved on a mountain, it is drawing on that layered memory. It is saying, at the edge of what can be reached, at the limit of habitability, in the highest stronghold, someone outweighted the chaos. From there, seeing the plains transformed, he stepped down into a new world. Whether that high place sheltered a literal timber barge wedged between rocks, or a subterranean chamber cut into the mountain itself, or some combination of built and natural refuge, is the historical question we cannot answer from texts alone. But the way mountains function symbolically across traditions makes one thing clear. The resting of the ark on a peak does not have to be only about the end of a sea voyage. It can be about the reopening of a storehouse. That is why the image feels so potent. You have the idea of a vault, a sealed container that has endured catastrophe. You have the idea of a mountain, the traditional site of hidden treasures, sacred decrees, and last refugees. Fuse them, and the ark becomes the ultimate mountain storehouse, both object and location of preservation, a portable treasury that finally comes to rest in the very landscape that, for ancient people, already represented endurance. If somewhere in the deep past highland communities really did retreat into caves and rock-cut halls to ride out a regional collapse, whether from climate, flood, war, or all three, their descendants might remember two things above all: that survival was hidden and that it was high. Over time, the details of carpentry and geology could blur, but the pairing of vault and mountain would remain. In that sense, the ark resting on a mountain is as much about memory as it is about geography. It preserves, in a story frame, the intuition that what saves a world is not open water and navigation, but secrecy, elevation, and the stubbornness of stone. And once you start to see the Flood Mountain as a kind of cosmic warehouse district, a zone of caves, chambers, and cellars holding the seeds of a future, another question arises. If life and goods can be stored there, what about information? What about the patterns of the old world, not just its animals and crops? From the image of a mountain stronghold filled with grain and flocks, it is a small step to the idea of a mountain archive, filled with tablets, scrolls, and the formulas of a lost age. When we hear that pairs of animals entered the ark, 2 by 2, our minds tend to picture a kind of living inventory. Giraffes next to elephants, lions next to lambs, everything in tidy lines. But that image comes from children's books more than ancient texts. The older stories are stranger, more selective, and less like a zoological census. In Genesis, the command is not take every living thing in equal numbers. It is of every clean animal by 7s and of the unclean by 2s. Birds are singled out. Certain creatures are never mentioned at all. In Mesopotamian versions, Utnapishtim lists his cargo in broad strokes. The seed of all living things, craftsmen, precious metals, and animals, but without a clear head count. What matters in these texts is not numerical completeness, but categories: clean and unclean, domestic and wild, sacrificial and profane. These are not the divisions of a modern conservation program. They are the divisions of a food and worship system. In an agrarian world, clean animals are not just morally acceptable, they are the ones you can eat in a ritual context, the ones you can offer on an altar, the ones that keep the link between people and gods unbroken. Sheep, goats, cattle, certain birds, creatures you can herd, manage, and breed with some predictability. Creatures whose blood and fat become the language of sacrifice. When a text says that more of these were taken aboard, it is not merely being fussy about purity laws. It is signalling that what must be preserved most carefully after a collapse is not just generic life, but the core of a functioning temple and table. Enough animals to restart worship, enough breeding stock to restart herds, enough clean bodies to ensure that offerings and meals can resume in the new world without contamination. Seen through that lens, the Ark is not a wildlife park. It is a curated reserve of ritual and agricultural essentials. That makes sense if the Ark is a vault in a mountain, rather than a boat on the water. A community building such a refuge does not have infinite space. They must make ruthless choices. Do you try to keep a pair of every species from your entire region, right down to insects and predators you fear? Or do you focus on what you actually depend on each year? Your sheep and goats, your lines of barley and wheat, your date palms and vines, your bees, your dogs, the birds you rely on for meat and omens. Ancient farmers knew breeding in practice, even if they did not express it in modern genetic terms. They knew which rams improved flocks, which cows produced more milk, which dogs guarded better, which seeds gave higher yields. They selected, saved, and culled. They watched for deformities, weakness, and traits that did not thrive. Over generations, they shaped the living stuff of their world. So if they foresaw disaster, rains that would not stop armies on the march, a sky gone wrong, they would not think in terms of preserving abstract species. They would think in terms of lines, herds, and varieties, representatives of each type that mattered. 2 sheep might be enough to keep the bloodline going in a story, but in practice, any serious refugee would need more. A handful of ewes, a good ram or 2, maybe lambs. Enough genetic diversity to avoid inbreeding too fast. Enough numbers that losing a few in the chaos did not mean losing the whole line. Likewise with seeds, you do not store only 1 jar of barley. You store many jars from different fields with different traits, because some will fail, some will rot, some will not suit the altered climate after the catastrophe. The biblical emphasis on 7 pairs of clean animals may preserve a memory of that kind of redundancy, simplified into a sacred number. 7 is completeness, fullness, covenant, fullness, but behind the symbol sits a practical concern. You cannot restart an economy or a ritual system with a single breeding pair of your key domesticates. You need a viable population. This brings us to the clean and unclean categories themselves. In later Israelite law, these distinctions shaped daily eating, sacrifice, and identity, but they likely grew out of much older Near Eastern patterns. Which animals are safe? Which align with local gods? Which embody chaos? Which are taboo? Pigs in some areas are acceptable. In others, they become suspect because they wallow, scavenge, and blur lines between wild and domestic. Predators that eat carrion may be avoided. Certain birds become omens, others are food. Fish with or without scales divide rivers and seas into permitted and forbidden zones. A vault built to outlast a collapse in that world would not aim to preserve everything neutrally. It would aim to preserve the right combinations. the animals you can slaughter on an altar without angering the divine, the ones whose flesh does not make you impure, the ones whose presence at a sanctuary signals order rather than disorder. In that reading, the Ark's cargo list is a blueprint for re-establishing a whole way of life after ruin. Not only do you need grain and flocks, you need the exact organisms that keep your covenant, your taboos, and your sacred meals intact. But animals and grains are only the beginning of what such a mountain vault might hold. Think of seeds. In every traditional farming society, seed saving is a sober art. Families keep back the best portion of each harvest, not to eat but to plant. They store them in jars, baskets, or pits. They choose kernels that are full, unbugged, from plants that did well in the year's conditions. Now imagine climate turning violent. Flood one year, drought the next. You do not know what the weather will be after the chaos. Do you save only one type of barley, one type of wheat, one type of pulse? Or do you store a range, early and late maturing, drought-resistant and flood-tolerant, some from fields on hills, some from fields by rivers? A real ark vault, built by people who had seen cycles of abundance and failure, would almost certainly function as a seed bank long before the phrase existed. Jars labelled, or at least remembered, by family and field. Bundles of cuttings from vines, olives, figs, pomegranates, perhaps even tubers, corms, and bulbs buried in cool chambers, hoping to sprout in the soil of a future they cannot yet see. Alongside food crops, there would be medicinal plants, leaves and roots whose properties are known only to specialists, dried herbs for fevers, resins for wounds, barks for pain, seeds for childbirth. Many of these would be wild gathered rather than cultivated, so a vault might contain dried specimens or carefully packed soil from regions where those plants grow, in case their habitats vanish. Craft knowledge, too, rides on matter. Pigments for dyes, ores and ingots, special clays from particular riverbanks that make superior pots, fibres from reeds or trees used in rope, textiles and sandals. A community facing collapse would know that when landscapes change, access to those precise materials may be lost. Storing samples, tools and instructions becomes a way to keep techniques alive. And finally, written memory. If the people building this mountain refuge have writing, they will not trust only oral tradition to carry their laws, stories, and technical recipes through whatever comes. They will etch tablets with contracts, myths, genealogies, ritual instructions. They will copy incantations, astronomical observations, lists of kings. They may seal these in jars, in niches in the rock, or in upper chambers carved above the main storerooms. If they do not yet write, they will still find ways to fix memory in material, knotted cords, carved symbols, pictorial sequences on stone slabs. Anything that lets the future decode the past without relying entirely on a single fragile chain of storytellers. In that expanded picture, the Ark becomes less like a cramped menagerie and more like a layered archive of life. Animals stand for more than themselves. Cattle carry ploughs, milk, leather, wealth. Sheep carry wool, sacrifice, calendars of feasts. Goats carry mobility in harsh terrain. Birds carry omens and seasonal cues. Bees carry sweetness and fermentation. Each creature is a knot in a web of practices, rituals, calendars, and meanings. Seeds are not just calories. They are varieties adapted to microclimates, tied to particular feast days and offerings. Used in breads, beers, and porridges that define festivals and fasts. Medicinal plants are not just pharmacology. They are wrapped in charms, taboos, and divine epithets. Even the categories of clean and unclean inscribe entire worldviews into flesh, where you can eat, with whom, in what state of body and soul. If you preserve those categories through a catastrophe, you are preserving a cultural map as much as a biological one. A vault that tries to carry such a world across a rupture must therefore preserve an ecosystem in the broadest sense. Not only bodies but relations. Not just animals and seeds, but the knowledge of which animals may be killed when which seeds must be offered first fruits, which herbs align with which gods, which metals belong in which ritual objects. This is where the idea of an archive of life begins to blur the line between biology and culture. In the modern imagination, an archive stores words and images. In the ancient experience, the living archive is a household, a herd, an orchard, a temple complex. The Ark story compresses all of that into one container. But if we re-expand it toward a mountain vault, it becomes easier to see the range of what would have been at stake. After a world collapse, whether by water, invasion, plague, or some slower grinding failure, survivors step out onto altered ground. Rivers may have shifted, soils may have soured, old cities may be ruins, wild flora and fauna may have changed range or vanished. In that moment, what you carried into the refuge decides not only whether you live, but what kind of people you can remain. If you brought only your bodies, you might survive as hungry, terrified refugees, forced to adopt whatever plants and animals you find. If you brought your animals, seeds and tablets, you can attempt something bolder, to replant your previous world in miniature and let it grow again. The Ark as mountain vault, then, is not just an insurance policy on life in general. It is an attempt at cultural continuity, a way to reach across a break in time and pull through not only flesh and blood, but gods, laws, calendars, crafts, flavours, and names. Later storytellers remember this in simplified form: pairs of animals, a righteous man, a rainbow. But beneath that simplification may lie the memory of a more complex project, a community that feared not only drowning, but forgetting. A people who understood that to lose certain sheep, certain seeds, certain scrolls, was to lose themselves. And that raises the next question: if such an archive of life ever existed in the deep past, not as a floating zoo, but as a mountain vault, what traces of it could possibly remain for us to find? Archaeology, at first glance, seems like the perfect tool to answer that question. If a mountain vault once held animals, seeds, tools, and tablets to restart a world, surely we could find it. A sealed chamber in a cliff, a fortified storehouse on a peak, a complex of rooms with odd concentrations of bones and jars. Surely somewhere the earth has kept the receipts. But archaeology does not work like a treasure hunt with a neat prize at the end. It works like listening to a conversation in a room where most of the people are gone and most of the words have faded. The first thing to keep in mind is scale. A single refuge, even a large and well-built one, is tiny compared to the vastness of the landscapes we are talking about. The northern arc of the Fertile Crescent, the Anatolian plateaus, the Zagros and Caucasus ranges, the highlands above ancient floodplains, these are riddled with caves, valleys and ridges. Many have never been systematically surveyed. Many more have been eroded, buried by landslides, or built over by later settlements. Even if one group, in one catastrophe, carved a sophisticated mountain vault, the odds that we would stumble on precisely that site thousands of years later, with enough intact to cry out Ark, are not very high. And that is assuming it survived at all. Most ancient structures do not. Mud brick, timber, reed matting, woven roofs, all the cheap and common stuff of construction dissolves, burns, or is recycled. Stone walls and rock-cut chambers fare better, but they too collapse under earthquakes, freeze-thaw cycles, and simple neglect. Over time, even the most careful design returns to being part of the hill. On top of that, human beings are excellent at erasing their own past. A sacred refuge used by one community can be quarried for stone by another. A mountain sanctuary can become a fortress, then a monastery, then a ruin. Every new use scrapes off traces of the old. So when we ask why archaeologists have not yet dug up the Ark, we are not really asking a fair question. We are asking why, out of all possible refuges, all possible caves and vaults and shrines, one particular structure tied to one particular narrative has not stepped forward with a label attached. What archaeology does give us instead are patterns. We see plentiful evidence for floods and environmental shocks. River valleys in Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Anatolia show layers of silt and clay that speak of sudden inundation. Lake cores and cave deposits record shifts in rainfall, droughts, storms. Around 4,200 years ago, for instance, there is a noticeable climatic event across the Near East, a drying and cooling that some scholars link to political collapses and migrations. Earlier and later pulses of change appear as well. We see evidence for collapses of complex societies, cities that shrink or are abandoned, administrative buildings burned and not rebuilt, long-distance trade networks that snap, pottery styles that suddenly change as new peoples move in or as survivors adopt simpler ways of life. We see, too, the architecture of storage and protection. From some of the earliest farming villages, people are obsessed with keeping things safe. Subfloor storage pits lined with plaster, clay bins built against house walls. Later, whole rooms dedicated to sealed jars, stamped bulla, and ration tablets, fortified granaries where food is guarded with something like paranoia. In upland regions we find rock-cut chambers and cisterns, caves with evidence of repeated use for hiding, hoarding and worship, high places with altars and small enclosures. Sometimes in times of war or persecution, people stashed valuables in these spaces. Jars of coins, scrolls, cult objects, emergency supplies. Think of the Dead Sea Scrolls, sealed in jars and left in caves above a harsh desert lake, only to be found by chance 2,000 years later. All of this tells us that people in the ancient Near East were capable of building refuges, both above ground and carved into rock. They had the motive: floods, invasions, droughts, and political chaos. They had the means: tools, quarrying techniques, knowledge of how to keep grain, wine, and oil over long periods. They had precedents: shrines in caves, mountain sanctuaries, storehouses attached to temples and palaces. In other words, archaeology can show that the general idea of a protective vault, even in a mountain, fits well within the known repertoire of ancient practices. What it cannot do, at least so far, is isolate one of these many practices and say, with certainty, this is the Ark. Part of the problem is that the Ark is not just an object, but a story. It carries theological weight, narrative motifs, later retellings, and embellishments. For a find to be accepted as the Ark in the popular sense, it would have to match not just the existence of a refuge, but the expectations built up by centuries of reading and imagination. Scholars, quite reasonably, do not work that way. They do not label a site Noah's Vault because it is old, high, and interesting. They look for direct, datable, contextual evidence. In the absence of an inscription that says something like, "This is the storage house of insert name, built before the Great Flood," they are more cautious. A late Neolithic storage complex, a Bronze Age mountain sanctuary, a fortified granary from such and such a culture. This caution is one reason why most famous Ark claims remain, at best, unconvincing. From the 19th century onward, expeditions have climbed Mount Ararat and neighbouring peaks with the hope of finding ship-like remains. Explorers report wooden beams emerging from ice, unusual rock formations, radar anomalies. Photos are printed, measurements are taken, sometimes dramatic announcements are made. Yet when archaeologists and geologists examine these claims, the solid ground tends to crumble. Wood fragments turn out to be modern or undateable. Ship shapes resolve into natural rock outcrops. Radar and satellite images, once ground-truthed, show nothing more than ordinary geology. Access to sites is often limited, documentation incomplete, and independent verification rare. Other supposed Ark sites are really just ancient settlements or fortifications with no clear link to any flood story. A large structure on a mountaintop, a cluster of walls on a ridge, a cave with animal bones and potsherds. These are intriguing, but they are what we would expect in any landscape where people have lived and sought safety for millennia. In the absence of inscriptions or a clear chain of tradition, archaeology alone cannot turn them into the Ark. There is an irony here. Those who are eager to prove that the Ark was a literal boat sometimes seize on any ambiguous feature as confirmation. Those who are equally eager to dismiss any Ark scenario use the same lack of decisive evidence as proof that the entire story must be pure fiction. Both moves lean too hard on what archaeology has not shown. The fact that we have not found a single, definitive Ark structure on Mount Ararat or anywhere else does not prove that a boat once floated there, but it also does not by itself prove that no mountain vault or flood refuge ever existed in the deep past. Absence of proof is not proof of the opposite. It is just absence, a silence in the record that can be filled with many possible melodies, some more plausible, some less. What archaeology can do is set the boundaries of reasonable speculation. It can tell us that large sea-going wooden ships from the Bronze Age and earlier almost never survive, unless they're buried in unusual circumstances. Anoxic mud, deep underwater, or intentional burial like the Egyptian solar boats. A wooden ark perched intact on a high peak, exposed to wind, snow and sun for thousands of years, would not realistically be expected to endure. It would rot, burn, or be cannibalized for fuel and building material long before modern times. It can tell us what kind of mountain or hillside constructions different cultures favoured, and in what periods. If we imagine a rock-cut vault in a Near Eastern mountain, we have to locate that design within actual traditions of cave use, temple building, and fortification. That can help us refine our picture. Was it more like a tomb complex, a cistern system, a cliffside monastery? Each analogy carries different expectations about layout, materials, and possible remains. It can show us regional sequences of flood myths, collapse stories, and ritual practices. If a certain area has multiple legends of a great deluge, plus archaeological evidence of major flooding, plus remains of unusual highland storage sites, then a story like the Ark Vault feels less like an alien intrusion and more like an intensification of existing patterns. At the same time, archaeology reminds us how much of human experience leaves only faint fingerprints. Oral traditions, fears, hopes, and theological interpretations do not fossilize. A community might experience a terrifying flood, retreat to a mountain refuge, store seeds and animals, survive, and then later tell their grandchildren of the time when the world ended and we were saved in the house on the hill. As that story is retold, embellished, and woven into sacred history, the original refugee might crumble, be reused, or be lost under a later fortress. The narrative lives on. The structure disappears. When we stand between legend and earth, then we have to think carefully. On one side, there is the temptation to force the spade to vindicate a sacred text line, byline. On the other, the temptation to treat any lack of direct correspondence as a license to invent whatever alternative theory we like. A high-tech ancient bunker, an alien device, a pure allegory with no historical referent at all. A more patient approach sits between those extremes. We can look at the Ark story as a layered tradition that may preserve memories of real disasters, real refuges, real struggles to preserve animals, seeds and knowledge. We can set those memories against the archaeological backdrop of floods, collapses, storage systems, and highland sanctuaries. We can then ask, where do these lines meet? Where does the material record make a vault-like Ark plausible, not as a single pinpointed building we can excavate and label, but as a type of response to crisis that ancient people demonstrably practiced? And we can also admit where the lines do not meet, where there is no evidence for a global flood, no indication that every species was ever bottlenecked through one family storehouse, no trace of a world reset in the absolute sense some readings imagine. In that space between what the ground can show and what the stories claim, humility is useful. The vault idea we have been exploring An ark as a mountain storehouse, built after a devastating collapse, is not proven by the absence of a wooden ship on Ararat, nor by every flood layer in Mesopotamian soil. It is a way of reading old texts through the lens of known human behaviour, the urge to protect seeds, animals, and scripts when the world seems to be coming apart. Archaeology cannot give us Noah's address or a GPS coordinate for his vault, but it can give us a landscape filled with people who feared drowning, famine, and forgetting, and who carved their fears and their precautions into the hills. That, in turn, shapes how we receive the Ark story itself, not as a puzzle waiting for a single spectacular artifact to solve it, but as a bridge between material practice and mythic memory. If we listen closely to that bridge, another question begins to emerge. Not only what, if anything, lies behind the ark in the soil of the past, but why this particular story, in all its variations, continues to grip imaginations long after the wooden beams, if there ever were any, have turned to dust. Part of the answer lies in what you just heard. This is not only a question about what once happened, but about why a certain way of telling it will not go away. The Ark story, in almost any version, sits at the crossroads of four powerful themes: survival, judgment, memory, and renewal. It is a survival story first. A world drowns, burns, or crumbles, and a few make it through. The story lingers because it whispers a possibility most people secretly want to believe, that in the worst imaginable crisis, there might be a way to endure. Whether that endurance comes by building a boat, climbing to a high refuge, or sealing a vault, the core promise remains the same. There is a door that can close against the storm. It is a story of judgment as well. A world has become corrupt, violent, or heedless. The collapse is not just random bad luck, it is framed as consequence. That pattern is emotionally potent. When we watch our own world flirt with ecological damage, inequality, or war, it is tempting to see disasters as a verdict. Floods, fires, pandemics, market crashes. Each can be narrated as the bill coming due. The Ark, in this sense, is not only about being rescued, it is about being found worthy, or at least prepared when the reckoning comes. Yet the story does not end in ash. It is also about memory. The Ark, whatever shape it takes, is a container for what must not be forgotten. In ancient texts, that might mean animals and seeds, but also names, covenants, laws. In later retellings, it becomes a repository of the things that make the world recognizably human. The Ark survives because it dramatizes a question that haunts every age. What do we carry through disaster? And what do we let sink? Finally, it is a story of renewal. The waters recede, the door opens, something green appears. A dove with an olive leaf, a rainbow in the clouds, a first planting after famine. The Ark is never just a bunker, it is a womb. It holds the possibility that after collapse, life can begin again. Perhaps wiser, perhaps more grateful, perhaps under a new kind of order. Those four threads are strong enough to be woven again and again into different tapestries, and that is exactly what happens. Every age reimagines the Ark according to its own fears. In regions scarred by real floods, the Ark is a vessel on the water. People who live by rivers that routinely burst their banks, or on coasts lashed by storms, do not need much help imagining a world covered in waves. For them, the Ark as boat is obvious, a last bobbing island of safety, cut free from the drowning land. In times when war is the main terror, the Ark can look more like a fortress. Medieval artists sometimes painted it with battlements and lookout towers, like a small castle afloat. The fear then was not only of water, but of enemies, sieges, and raids. A walled refuge, whether on land or at sea, made intuitive sense. In eras obsessed with purity and guilt, the Ark becomes a clean box floating above a polluted world. The focus shifts from physical survival to moral selection. Those inside are the righteous few. Those outside are the condemned many. The story is retold as a warning, a line drawn between insiders and outsiders, the saved and the lost. Then in our own time, the fears change again. We worry about climate change, but also about industrial accidents, nuclear war, pandemics, artificial intelligence, economic collapse. The possible disasters are not just floods, they are systemic failures of a vast interconnected civilization. In that context, the Ark begins to resemble something else, a vault. It is no accident that one of the most famous modern projects inspired by these anxieties is literally a vault in the far north, bored into a mountain, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. Built to safeguard crop diversity against war, disease and climate change, it is a chilled cave packed with envelopes of sleeping life. Photos of its icy entrance are often captioned half seriously as Noah's Ark for plants. The metaphor travels easily because the underlying logic is the same. When we imagine the future unravelling, we imagine gathering up the critical pieces, seeds, DNA, data, cultural treasures, and hiding them in a hard, cold place where flood, fire and looters cannot reach. The vault interpretation of the Ark is, in many ways, a mirror in which modern people see their own fears. We understand repositories now: servers, bunkers, backup drives, cryogenic freezers. We imagine catastrophe in terms of data loss, biodiversity loss, institutional collapse. So we picture the Ark less as a wooden hull on the waves and more as a hardened storage facility, an archive of life waiting in the dark. Once you notice that pattern, it becomes easier to see why different readers are drawn to different versions of the Ark. Some favour a literal boat because it satisfies a particular need, the desire for a concrete, historical, almost journalistic account. The world flooded, a man built a ship of given dimensions, loaded real animals, and rode out a real storm. This reading emphasises divine power and faithfulness. The boat stands as a proof that God acts in history, that obedience can have tangible physical rewards, that there was once, somewhere, a keel cutting through muddy water. Others treat the Ark primarily as a symbolic vessel. They are less concerned with its exact shape and more with what it carries. For them, the Ark is a story raft, bearing themes of cleansing, repentance, and second chances. It can stand for the mind protected from chaos, the community preserved amid corruption, the spiritual path that ferries the soul across dangerous waters. The literal historical details recede. The inner meaning stays sharp. Still others are drawn to the Ark as a post-collapse vault. They imagine a world already shattered by some earlier event, flood, war, or slow ecological decline, and a group of survivors who deliberately construct a mountain storehouse to ride out the aftermath. In this reading, the Ark is not a miraculous exception dropped into normal times. It is a rational, if desperate, human project in an already abnormal age. Why does this version appeal? Because it aligns neatly with things we can see: ancient storage practices, our own seed banks and data centers, our plans for bunkers and off-planet colonies. It takes the Ark story and says, perhaps this is how people, much like us, responded to a crisis, much like the ones we fear. It does not require a single global flood, only a disaster big enough that for one region, one culture, the world as they knew it truly ended. And importantly, it offers a picture in which human forethought and technology matter. In the boat reading, the critical act is obedience to a divine command. In the symbolic reading, the focus is inner transformation. In the vault reading, the emphasis falls on planning, engineering, and curation. What you choose to lock away, and how you design a refuge to last beyond your own lifetime. None of these readings fully cancels the others. They overlap, compete, and blend. A literalist might still see symbolic layers in the boat. A symbolic reader might leave room for a kernel of historical crisis. A vault theorist might acknowledge mythic embellishment around a core of practical survival. The endurance of the Ark story may lie precisely in this flexibility. It is roomy enough to hold different kinds of fear, different hopes, different theologies. It can be drawn as a child's bathtub toy or as a blueprint for survivalism. It can be preached from pulpits, analysed in seminars, invoked in environmental campaigns, and quietly mulled over by someone lying awake at night, wondering what they would save if they had to pack the world into a single room. When you think of it that way, the question of whether the Ark was a boat, a symbol, or a vault becomes less about picking a winner and more about listening to what each version reveals. The boat speaks to a universe where the elements themselves are instruments of divine will, and where rescue comes from outside, unearned except by trust. The symbolic vessel speaks to the inner landscape, where floods are psychological or moral crises, and the Ark is any path that carries you through without losing what matters most. The vault speaks to a world of fragile systems, where knowledge and diversity can be lost in a generation, and where survival depends on advanced planning and the careful protection of seeds, species, and stories. Each interpretation is a way of answering the same set of worries. Will we be judged for what we have done to each other and to the earth? If a great interruption comes, can anything of what we are be preserved? Is there a pattern, a promise, a covenant that stretches beyond the next storm? The ancient writers who set down the Ark story framed their answer in the language of their time. Floods, mountains, altars, sacrifices, rainbows. Later ages have added their own accents. We, with our satellites and stock markets and nuclear reactors, naturally hear in it the echo of vault doors closing on shelves of samples and servers. Archaeology, texts, and comparative myth can take us only so far. They can align our possibilities with what is reasonable, cut away the least likely fantasies, ground our speculation in known human behaviour. They can suggest that people have always built refuges, that they have always told stories about the day the world nearly ended, that they have always tried to pass on a core of life and memory to those who come after. What they cannot finally do is stand above the Ark story and rule once and for all. This is what it really means, and nothing else. We are left instead with a tale that keeps inviting each generation to project its own crises and hopes onto its wooden or stone or imagined walls. Perhaps that is why the story endures when so many other ancient narratives fade. It is not just about a particular flood in a particular valley. It is about the recurring human experience of standing on the edge of something vast and frightening, and wondering if there is any shelter that can hold against it. A boat on the waters, a chest of meaning in a sea of confusion, a vault in the mountain after the last great collapse. We can sift texts and sediments in search of which, if any, has roots in our distant past. But even if we never find decisive proof for one, the Ark will likely remain, hovering between history and hope, a question we keep asking in new forms. If everything broke again, what would we build to carry life through the dark? And what, in the end, would we choose to lock inside? So we arrive slowly at a kind of stillness. We have walked through the Ark as a boat, riding a flood. We have imagined it as a sealed chamber in the side of a mountain guarding seeds and stories after some older world fell apart. We have treated it as a symbol, a vessel of meaning rather than timber, a way of thinking about judgment, loss and second chances. None of these needs to be the final word. The Ark can be read as fragmentary history, perhaps echoing a real disaster in a real landscape, remembered and retold until the details blurred and the meaning grew. It can be read as cultural memory, a condensation of many smaller crises into one great narrative of ending and beginning. It can be read as mythic symbol, a story the human mind keeps inventing whenever it feels the ground shake under its feet. Or it can be held as some shifting blend of all three, history wrapped in memory, wrapped in symbol, like layers of old sediment pressed into a single stone. When you listen to the tale with that in mind, the edges soften. The question, was the Ark really a boat or really a vault, becomes less a demand for a photograph from the past and more an invitation to notice what the story is doing in the present. For some, it will always be primarily sacred history, anchored in faith. For others, it will be a psychological map of how people face catastrophe. For still others, the vault idea will ring truest, a plausible, almost unsettlingly familiar picture of humans deliberately building a storehouse to carry forward animals, seeds, tools, texts, whatever they thought a new world would most need. Whichever way you lean, the core image remains stubbornly simple. In the heart of the tale is a small group of people, aware that something vast is coming, gathering what life they can, and stepping into an enclosed space while the old world breaks outside. They wait, not knowing exactly what will be left when the doors open again. They trust that the fragile cargo they have chosen to protect will be enough to begin anew. Sometimes that space is a hull creaking on rough water. Sometimes it is a stone corridor deep in the mountain. Sometimes it is only a quiet room in the mind where memories and values are kept safe against the noise of the age. But the gesture is the same. Hands reaching out, selecting, protecting, hoping that some thread of continuity can be pulled across the gap. Perhaps that is the most important part to carry with you as you drift towards sleep. Not a firm conclusion about wood versus stone, myth versus record, but the long persistent human effort to ferry life through disaster into dawn. Generation after generation, people have imagined that effort in different shapes and given it different names. One of those names is the Ark. As you lie wherever you are tonight, listening to this, you are part of that long line of listeners, adding your own thoughts to the story. If you feel like sharing, you're welcome to leave a comment with how you picture the Ark now, and where in the world you're listening from. If this quiet journey through old texts and possible vaults has kept you company, you can gently tap like or subscribe or leave a few words below. It helps this kind of slow, wandering history find its way to others who might need something calm and thoughtful to fall asleep to. For now, we leave the Ark where it has always been, half in the past, half in the imagination, a question that does not need to be fully answered to be worth holding. Somewhere, in story, if not in stone, a door closes against the storm. Inside, in the dimness, life waits and breathes, ready for whatever new world will open when the quiet finally breaks.